Chapter 10. A Biblical Theory of the Cycles of History. An interpretive framework based on Genesis 47 and the Covenant of 4 and 7. Author, Manuel Martínez. Introduction. This document presents a theoretical and interpretive framework for understanding historical cycles through a biblical and numerological lens, inspired by Genesis 47:11. It does not claim empirical or scientific certainty, nor does it seek to replace established historical or economic models. Rather, it proposes a moral and structural reading of time, rooted in ancient biblical symbolism and applied to the unfolding of civilizations. Numerology, as used here, is not superstition. It is treated as an ancient symbolic language, present in Egyptian, Hebrew, and classical traditions, long before modern historiography. In this framework, numbers are not predictive tools but organizational principles that give structure and meaning to historical experience. Genesis 47:11 and the concept of covenant. Genesis 47:11 describes Joseph settling his family in Egypt and organizing land, sustenance, and authority under Pharaoh. Beyond its historical narrative, this verse symbolizes a foundational act, the ordering of space, people, and time under covenant. A covenant is not merely an agreement, it is a moral alignment between divine order and human stewardship. In this text, that alignment is represented numerically by 4 and 7. 4 symbolizes the created world, land, matter, structure, and physical reality. 7 symbolizes divine order, completion, moral law, and transcendence. Together, 4 by 7 forms the structural rhythm of time. The foundational cycle, 28 years. The smallest complete unit in this model is 28 years, 4 by 7. This period corresponds roughly to a generational shift, political and institutional correction, cultural realignment. Throughout history, major political, economic, and ideological changes often occur within 25 to 30-year intervals. These are not coincidences, but manifestations of a structural rhythm embedded in time. Cumulative cycles of history. Unlike models that treat cycles as repetitive loops, this theory proposes cumulative cycles. Each cycle carries forward unresolved moral, institutional, and cultural weight. The principal cycles: 28 years, correction and adjustment; 56 years, 2 by 28, institutional maturation and stress; 84 years, 3 by 28, covenant cycle, full human lifespan; 112 years, 4 by 28, civilizational judgment; 140 years, 5 by 28, closure and reset. Each cycle does not replace the previous one, it deepens it. The 84-year cycle, memory and amnesia. The 84-year cycle is central. It approximates a full human life. When this cycle completes, the generation that experienced the previous crisis has largely passed away. What follows is collective amnesia. At this point, societies are no longer restrained by living memory. The same unresolved forces, political extremism, economic excess, and moral decay return. History does not repeat mechanically, it tests again. This is why civilizations often face similar crises separated by roughly 8 decades. The question history asks is not new, but the witnesses are. Judgment as revelation, not punishment. In this framework, Judgment is not destruction. It is revelation. Civilizations do not collapse because they are suddenly struck down. They collapse because time exposes what was already broken beneath the surface. The longer cycles, 112 and 140 years, do not introduce failure. They reveal it. Those societies that respond with humility, reform, and memory are refined. Those that deny responsibility dissolve. Comparison with modern cycle theories. This theory does not contradict established models, it complements them. Kondratiev explains long economic waves. Strauss-Howe explains generational psychology. Ray Dalio explains debt, power, and empire. What those models do not address directly is moral accountability. This theory proposes that beneath economics, generations, and power lies a deeper layer: covenant. History is not only a system, it is a reckoning. History as accountability. The central question of this framework is simple. Was the covenant honored or broken? History does not render account to empires, markets, or ideologies because all of them pass away. It renders account to the principle that ordered time itself. In biblical language, this principle is God. In philosophical language, it is moral law. In historical language, it is a responsibility inherited across generations. Conclusion. History is not neutral. Time is not empty. Cycles are not accidental. They are structured, measured, and demand response. Civilizations are not judged for their power, but for what they do with what they inherit. Every generation receives an invisible trust, and every generation must answer. History does not merely move forward. It remembers. It examines. And it renders account. Below is a clear, sober explanation of the biblical basis of Manuel Martínez's theory, focused on Genesis 47:11 in the original Hebrew context, and its connection to the covenant between Yhwh, Jehovah, and Abraham. This is presented as theological symbolic interpretation, not as doctrine. Chapter 11. The basis of Manuel Martínez's theory. Genesis 47:11 and the Abrahamic covenant. 1. Genesis 47:11, context and meaning. Genesis 47:11, Hebrew Bible, narrative context, describes how Joseph settles his father Jacob, Israel, and his brothers in the land of Egypt, specifically in the land of Ramesses, Goshen, during the famine. Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers, and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. At the surface, this verse is administrative and geographic: land allocation, settlement, and stewardship. But within the biblical narrative, land is never neutral, it is always tied to covenant. 2. The Hebrew logic, order, land, and covenant. In the Hebrew Bible, three ideas are inseparable: land, eretz, eretz; people, am, covenant, beret. Genesis 47:11 represents a moment of ordered placement. Israel is preserved, not destroyed. The family is settled, not wandering. Authority, Pharaoh, recognizes Joseph's stewardship. God's promise continues inside a foreign empire. This is crucial. The covenant is not broken even when Israel is outside the promised land. 3. Connection to the Abrahamic covenant. To understand Genesis 47:11, one must return to God's covenant with Abraham, Genesis 12, 15 and 17. The core promises to Abraham. God makes three fundamental promises. Land. To your offspring I will give this land, Gen 12-7. Seed, multiplication. I will make you into a great nation, Gen 12-2. Blessing to the nations. Through you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Gen 12-3. This covenant is unilateral, God binds himself. Generational, covenantal, not contractual, marked by time and multiplication. 4. Genesis 47:11 as a covenant preservation moment. In Martínez's reading, Genesis 47:11 is not about Egypt, it is about continuity of covenant under pressure. Key observations. Israel is preserved during famine, a biblical symbol of judgment/testing. The people are placed in the best land, not marginal land. The covenant people grow numerically in Egypt. Egypt becomes the womb, not the destination. This sets up a biblical pattern. Covenant to preservation, to multiplication to later judgment, to Exodus. Genesis 47:11 is therefore a hinge verse. The covenant is protected. Time is extended. History is structured. 5. Numbers and structure. 4 and 7 in biblical thought. Manuel Martínez's theory draws from biblical numerology, not astrology. In Scripture, 4 equals the created order, 4 directions, 4 corners of the earth, material completeness. 7 equals divine completion and covenant, creation week, Sabbath, covenantal cycles. Their multiplication, 4 times 7 equals 28, symbolizes divine order imposed on human history. In Martínez's framework, history moves when God allows time to unfold. Cycles expand as memory fades and responsibility increases. Each cycle tests whether the covenant is remembered or forgotten. 6. Covenant as moral time, key distinction. In this interpretation, time is not neutral. Biblical time is accountable, measured, covenantal. Genesis 47:11 shows God ordering time through land and people. History moving forward under stewardship. A pause before later judgment, Exodus. Thus, Martínez's theory does not say history repeats mechanically. It says history unfolds in measured covenantal stages until accountability arrives. 7. Why Genesis 47:11 matters for the theory. For Martínez, Genesis 47:11 represents the moment when covenant enters a foreign system. The alignment of material order, land, with divine promise. The beginning of historical time under covenantal oversight. From this moment onward, Israel grows. Time accumulates. Memory fades. Judgment eventually comes, Exodus. This pattern, settlement, growth, forgetting, judgment, renewal becomes the template for later historical cycles. Summary in one paragraph. In Manuel Martínez's theory, Genesis 47:11 symbolizes the moment when God preserves the Abrahamic covenant by ordering people and land under stewardship, even within a foreign empire. Rooted in the original Hebrew understanding of Berit, covenant, the verse represents structured time rather than random history. The covenant given to Abraham, land, multiplication, and blessing continues through measured stages, and history unfolds in cycles, not because it is trapped, but because covenantal responsibility is tested across generations. Core sentence, theological framing. History moves in cycles not because God repeats himself, but because humanity is given time to remember or forget the covenant entrusted to it. Genesis 47, and the covenant of the numbers 4 and 7. Every theory of historical time requires an anchor, not merely a chronological starting point, but a foundational act. In this work, that anchor is found in a short, precise, and deeply symbolic passage, Genesis 47. Not as an isolated narrative, but as a covenantal structure, a numerical architecture, and a model of economic, political, and moral order. Genesis 47 recounts the moment in which Joseph, administrator of Egypt, establishes a new system during the Great Famine. Land is reorganized, production is centralized, the population is preserved, and at the heart of the arrangement appears a proportion that has gone largely unnoticed by many interpreters: 1/5 for Pharaoh, 4/5 for the people. This division 4 and 1 forms a complete whole, yet its full meaning emerges only when placed within the broader biblical framework dominated by the number 7, the number of sacred completion. This passage describes more than an emergency economic policy. It establishes a covenant of survival and agreement among authority, people, and transcendence. Life is preserved, but not without order. Survival is made possible through proportion, responsibility, and restraint. The Bible does not use numbers arbitrarily. From Genesis to Revelation, numbers function as a structural language. 4 represents the created world, the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 winds, the ordered and habitable earth. 7, by contrast, signifies sacred totality, the completed cycle, rest, fulfillment, consecrated time. The covenant of 4 and 7 is therefore a covenant between earth and time, between the human and the divine, between production and rest, between material order and transcendent meaning. Read through this lens, Genesis 47 ceases to be a mere historical episode and becomes a replicable model. Its message is clear. When a society organizes its economy with proportion, responsibility, and limits, life is preserved. When that balance is broken, when accumulation becomes limitless, when power concentrates without restraint, when the covenant is forgotten, the cycle fractures and correction becomes inevitable. Manuel Martínez argues that this numerical covenant did not remain confined to the biblical world. It projected forward through history, reappearing consciously or unconsciously at foundational moments of civilization. One such moment is the founding of the United States of America. The selection of July 4th as the founding date was not accidental. Although the Declaration of Independence was signed weeks later, the Founding Fathers deliberately chose the 4th day of the 7th month to seal a new covenant. Many of them, Benjamin Franklin among the most prominent, were deeply influenced by Masonic, Rosicrucian, and Pythagorean traditions, in which numbers were not decorative symbols but organizing principles of reality. Thus, the United States established a new historical covenant grounded once again in 4 and 7, territorial order, written law, separation of powers, electoral cycles, and a conception of manifest destiny that was not merely expansionist but providential. From this perspective, historical cycles are not only economic or political. They are covenantal. And when a nation or a civilization violates the implicit terms of that covenant, time itself begins to correct it. Here the cycles outlined in this book acquire full coherence. The 28-year cycle, 4 by 7, initiates correction. The 56-year cycle deepens the lesson. The 84-year cycle, 3 times 7, multiplied by 4, tests the entire society. This is not fatalism, but structural memory. History offers opportunities to learn. When those opportunities are ignored, the lesson intensifies. The Covenant of 4 and 7 explains why the same tensions return with unsettling regularity. It explains why societies forget limits during periods of prosperity, and why, after decades of excess, adjustment becomes unavoidable. It explains, ultimately, why history does not merely advance, but remembers. This book does not propose a superstitious reading of numbers. It proposes a structural one. Numbers do not predict, they organize. They do not determine, they reveal. They are the silent language through which history structures its tests. To understand Genesis 47 and the covenant of the numbers 4 and 7 is to understand that time is not neutral. It has structure, it has memory, and above all, it has expectations. When those expectations are honored, civilization flourishes. When they are ignored, the cycle closes. And when the cycle closes, time once again is held to account. Below is a careful, historically grounded explanation of this idea, presented explicitly as a symbolic interpretive reading, not as an established historical fact. I will distinguish clearly between documented history and interpretive meaning, so the argument remains coherent and credible.